I thought abandonment would feel dramatic, loud, and public. Instead, it sounded like an airport printer, a soft mechanical noise behind the counter while the agent stared at her screen. "I'm sorry," she said carefully. "Your ticket was cancelled this morning, intentionally, from the executive profile." At first, I smiled. My family was incapable of planning anything correctly unless I ran the logistical gears for them. But this was clear calculation. Would you have walked away right then, or stayed to see exactly how little you meant to them? Concrete has a way of absorbing unnecessary emotional noise. Leaving the passenger terminal behind, I commanded a taxi directly to the O'Hare cargo terminal, stepping back onto the oil-stained concrete loading docks of Warehouse B to anchor myself in data. My phone vibrated continuously across my palm, not with apologies from Gary or Teresa, but with a series of automated system queries and public notifications from the luxury group chat. Hayley had just uploaded a gallery from the Napa Valley Vineyard estate launch. The cover photo featured her holding a crystal glass of reserve vintage with the caption, "Finally starting the wedding and launch week." It had been posted 18 minutes prior. My father, stepmother, and Brandon flanked her, beaming with the pristine confidence of people who believed their spotlight was self-sustaining. No one had called me. No one had texted. They had simply cancelled my ticket to free up travel funds for one of their new VIP investors, assuming I would just quietly accept being left behind to run the warehouse. It wasn't just pettiness. It was a desperate liquidity crunch. By draining $1.5 million for the vineyard, they had redlined their primary credit accounts, and bumping me was the only way to fund a seat for the new investor without triggering a card decline at the gate. Only later did I understand what that moment really meant. What stayed with me wasn't the rejection at the gate, but the profound clarity that followed it. That is when I realized a fundamental truth about high responsibility roles. Some structures do not break with a catastrophic crash. They erode quietly, while the people inside the penthouse mistake the silence of the foundation for its insignificant compliance. I had spent 5 years running the physical logistics infrastructure of this business, ensuring the cold chain never broke, believing my utility would eventually be recognized as value. It was the classic trap of being the only responsible adult in a family that flat out refused to grow up. But my long-term endurance wasn't passive weakness, nor was it born of fear. It was a calculated, quiet containment strategy. As a systems architect, you learn to observe an unstable structure completely before executing a reset. I had allowed Teresa's growing entitlement to expand until it breached the limits of the system itself. Anger wasn't loud, it was clinical. While they stood in the California sun sipping champagne, I sat under the sterile glare of the warehouse fluorescent lights, opening the primary distribution registries to trace the digital fingerprints of my own erasure. My family had operated on a subscription where I was the only one footing the bill, treating my labor as a permanent public utility. I'd been the silent investor in their version of family, funding a luxury they had overdrafted for years. They assumed that because I solved problems quietly, the problems solved themselves. But a complex architecture does not require permission to stop running when its core anchor steps out of the loop. This wasn't a sudden emotional crisis. It was the moment everything became clear. I pulled up the master financial console, preparing to map out our active freight commitments and temperature-controlled shipping liabilities. As I opened the primary distribution ledger, I watched a live server node execute an unauthorized capital pull from our primary operational account, originating directly from the Napa Valley Resort coordinates at 6 a.m. Data does not have an emotional registry. For 5 consecutive years, I had functioned as the uncredited machinery of our family's multi-million-dollar culinary logistics empire. When Gary suffered his initial stroke, it was my signature that stabilized our fluctuating vendor deadlines, my automated tokens that ran the weekly payroll release windows, and my personal compliance oversight that secured our critical interstate temperature-controlled shipping leases. I was the one navigating state regulatory audits and baseline operational friction, while the rest of the executive tier focused entirely on corporate theater. While Hayley coasted through luxury lifestyle branding retreats funded completely by our corporate operating accounts, I lived strictly below my means in a modest studio apartment, redirecting every spare dollar back into our fleet infrastructure. I managed their heavy liabilities, while they treated our commercial asset pool as an open checkbook. Now, tracing the live capital pull on my monitor, I uncovered the raw, undeniable extent of their financial manipulation. Gary and Teresa had quietly extracted $1.5 million from our core operating cash flow to cover a high-stakes margin call on Haley's multi-million-dollar Napa vineyard development. It was a desperate move to prevent the entire project from entering immediate foreclosure. It was an explicit breach of corporate fiduciary duty. They had reallocated our essential physical shipping assets, including our proprietary cold storage leaseholds, to buy a temporary illusion of high society status for their new agricultural investors. They executed this transfer with total confidence, certain that I would remain safely in the dark, quietly sweeping the floor, managing the systemic risk, and absorbing the operational friction to prevent a commercial network default. True dependence is a quiet mechanism. When you systematically insulate people from the consequences of their own overhead, they do not develop gratitude. They simply develop a chronic cognitive blindness to the cost of their own lifestyle. For years, I had allowed them to treat my operational precision as a default resource. They mistook my silence for blind agreement, completely unaware that a corporate engine requires constant structural maintenance, not just aesthetic promotion. This wasn't a personal dispute. It was a cold accounting of risk metrics. I sat alone in the silent warehouse office, tracking the asset migration paths across the screen, calculating the exact exposure threshold of our primary logistics network. The system logs began flashing warning signs. By pulling that cash, they had drained our emergency accounts dangerously close to zero. The financial strain they had introduced to fund a single evening of public relations was already transmitting severe ripples through our primary banking interfaces. I watched the system parameters adjust in real time, refusing to intercept the automatic security alerts that were beginning to trigger across the network. At exactly 11:14 p.m., the master logistical hub pushed a critical risk alert to my screen. The massive Napa Valley transaction had been flagged and frozen by our bank's automated fraud department due to suspicious account activity. The messages hit my phone in a metallic, rapid sequence. Brandon and Teresa were calling and texting sequentially, their communication style shifting instantly from programmatic ignore to high-pressure demands. The frozen $80,000 hospitality shipment contained the entire premium temperature-controlled inventory required for Haley's morning press showcase in Napa Valley. Rather than inquiring why I was still sitting in a concrete terminal office in Chicago, or acknowledging the deliberate cancellation of my passenger ticket, my family immediately defaulted to aggressive white-collar bullying. Teresa's messages were laced with predictable emotional manipulation, explicitly defining me as an oversensitive, vindictive child who was actively trying to sabotage her sister's milestone out of pure petuelos. She treated my years of structural labor as a baseline requirement, an infinite overdraft facility she could draw upon while locking me out of the family ledger. Brandon's text demands were more transactional, aggressively demanding my administrative override codes to manually bypass the bank lock. His ignorance was staggering. He actually believed a corporate password could force a primary bank to ignore a federal fraud flag. He didn't realize that once a system detects $1 million anomaly, no code in the world can make it disappear without a formal audit. He went so far as to issue a definitive ultimatum: clear the system lock within the hour, or he would initiate an emergency board vote to permanently strip my compliance title and remove me from the operational registry. He conveniently forgot that my compliance title was tied to my 15% personal equity stake, a stake he couldn't touch without a protracted legal battle he was currently too broke to afford. They treated my corporate safety keys as a default transaction tool, completely certain that the economic threat of parental disapproval and professional demotion would force me back into compliance. I sat entirely motionless in the dim, humming, fluorescent glare of the warehouse office, reviewing their incoming messages with a detached, clinical focus, entirely refusing to respond to a single emotional trigger. In their escalating panic, they tried to force their way into the system using an outdated master password I had changed 2 winters ago. Instead of getting in, their repeated, failed attempts triggered an automatic security lockdown. It completely froze their executive accounts and locked them out of the system. I watched the incoming notifications scroll down my interface and realized that a boundary is never a tool for retaliation. It is simply a mirror that forces entitled people to finally face the harsh reality of their own actions without you there to clean up the mess. I noted calmly that manually overriding a bank-initiated freeze to cover up their missing funds would make me personally complicit in wire fraud, exposing me to federal prison time. They had spent years running an unregistered operational deficit, and they expected me to execute a fraudulent clearance to hide the shortfall. I placed my phone face down on the steel desk, launched the master network configuration interface, and clicked to deactivate my personal authentication tokens from the active network pool. A master compliance reset has no emotional weight. The rollout of an administrative hold moves with the predictable cold mathematics of an automated ledger. By removing my master security tokens from the distribution pool, I did not delete our corporate database or actively destroy our proprietary files. This wasn't an act of digital sabotage. I simply enforced Section 4 of our Operational Procedures Manual. Because the $1.5 million asset drain to the California vineyard development had occurred without a valid, documented board resolution, the shipping network automatically executed a protective safety freeze on every active interstate transit line linked to our logistics company. Systems do not possess an emotional register. When you have spent years quietly absorbing all the operational friction to keep an entire organization functional, the most profound statement you can make is to simply step back and let the machine run according to its own harsh reality. Within minutes of my token deactivation, the administrative network parameters locked into place. The automated security protocols at the Napa Valley hub initiated a total containment lock. The climate control stayed active to preserve the assets, but the electronic bay doors were sealed shut, making $80,000 worth of premium artisanal imports perfectly preserved, yet completely unreachable without my active compliance clearance. The master system registries flagged the lack of compliance clearance, and the freight software immediately began rejecting any manual override commands attempted from their remote location in California. At the same time, international banking transfers paused pending physical identity verification. When the luxury resort tried to run the final charges, the corporate cards were instantly declined. Desperate, my father tried to use his personal credit cards, only to discover they were already maxed out from years of privately funding their fake high society lifestyle. Back in the cold quiet of the Chicago terminal, I quietly closed my laptop. I placed my physical master keycard inside the center desk drawer of the steel desk, walked out of warehouse B, and caught a taxi back to my studio apartment. Before I left, I sent a blind copy memo to the floor leads, confirming their payroll was secured in a separate bonded account I had locked down weeks ago. My fight was with the penthouse, not the loading dock. There was no theatrical exit, no shouting, and no grand confrontation. I simply left the hidden machinery to run its automated course in the dark, while my father, stepmother, and brother remained completely stranded in the middle of their heavily promoted, rented stage. The silence in my living room was absolute. I turned off the network notification alerts on my secondary device, poured a glass of water, and slept for 5 uninterrupted hours. At exactly 5:45 a.m. the following morning, my father bypassed the frozen corporate system to call my personal number. His breathing was heavy. His usual, arrogant, booming voice was completely gone. "Abigail," Gary said, his voice dropping into a hollow, exhausted whisper I had never heard before. He was calling at dawn because the automated security protocols at the Napa terminal had completely locked them out, transmitting a cascade of high-priority access-denied alerts across the network as $80,000 worth of imported inventory sat perfectly chilled but completely unreachable behind sealed steel doors. Through the phone line, I could hear absolute chaos unfolding in the background. I could hear Haley weeping to an estate manager about the dying floral arrangements, while Brandon frantically attempted to negotiate an emergency short-term cash extension with a regional bank representative who kept repeating the institutional baseline requirements for an asset release. My father stayed completely silent for several seconds, listening to the slow disintegration of his luxury brand launch, before delivering a line that sounded like a man discovering his structural insignificance too late. "Why didn't you tell us things depended on you this much?" he asked, his voice barely carried by the microphone. I looked out my apartment window at the grey Chicago traffic moving slowly through the frost below. My posture was entirely relaxed. I reminded him, with the cool precision of a logistics auditor, that I had explicitly warned them about our operational vulnerabilities and single points of failure at 4 consecutive board meetings. I had laid out the data on the conference table, only to be systematically talked over by executives who believed operational infrastructure was a default resource that ran itself. He did not attempt to defend his choices. That was the precise moment I understood that dependence and respect are not the same currency. They had spent years relying on my compliance while treating my presence as an option, completely blind to the fact that an engine does not require your approval to stop running. His total lack of anger exposed the absolute, raw, unfiltered panic that had completely destabilized their fragile empire in less than 24 hours. But systems do not provide instant cinematic ruin. This was a realistic corporate dislocation defined by grinding friction rather than a total collapse. The vineyard launch and Haley's wedding still occurred 3 days later, but the entire affair was permanently downsized, delayed, and operationally compromised around the edges. Because our master accounts remained frozen pending an independent identity verification, several premium suppliers refused to grant standard credit extensions. Brandon was forced to lock the company into expensive, predatory short-term debt loops just to clear the immediate venue liabilities, permanently damaging their commercial credit reputation within the regional agricultural network. They had saved their public relations event, but they had traded their structural liquidity to pay for the stage. I hung up the phone without offering a retroactive clearance code. The mechanical reality of the ledger was already locked into motion, and the systemic alerts were compiling exactly as compliance protocols dictated. Legal posturing requires a cooperative audience. 2 weeks after the Napa Valley failure, my family assembled in the main executive suite of our Chicago headquarters. They brought along a senior defense attorney they had retained at a significant personal premium, clearly intending to treat this operational review as a high-stakes litigation theater. Teresa sat rigid, her arms folded across her designer blazer, while Brandon slid a signed, 3-page settlement proposal across the dark mahogany table. The document demanded that I immediately restore my master security tokens and retroactively sign off on the California land leaseholds. In exchange, they offered me a minor, non-voting corporate vice presidency, a title empty of structural equity, but wrapped in patronizing family vocabulary. They walked into the suite, expecting to order me back down into the basement, fully believing that their historical entitlement still held purchasing power. I left the paper completely untouched on the polished wood. Instead of answering, I opened the door to the adjacent conference room and introduced the independent forensic auditing team. I had retained them privately weeks ago using my personal savings, anticipating this exact structural failure, and they were now reporting their findings directly to our primary lenders. What my family failed to calculate was the rapid, unbuffered decay of an elite enterprise when its structural foundation steps away from the ledger. They had spent years under the illusion that their financial position was protected by their social status. But wealth without operational discipline is merely an expensive performance on a rented stage. The moment the empty wallet is stripped of its infrastructure, the facade falls away. The true balance of power does not shift through personal theatre. It executes naturally through parameters that do not care about your name. I clinically presented the forensic data to their attorney, demonstrating that their unauthorized extraction constituted a direct breach of our federal loan covenants and bank fraud. By misrepresenting operational funds as personal equity, they hadn't just betrayed me, they had committed a felony against our institutional lenders. Within 90 seconds, their expensive legal counsel realized he had absolutely no structural leverage. Gary sat in stunned silence as the hard metrics exposed their systematic asset manipulation, realizing that their historical exploitation had trapped them in an ironclad institutional cage. What stayed with me wasn't the argument, it was the silence after. I can admit now that a small part of me wanted to hear them defend the theft, if only to analyze how their entitlement would reframe a federal compliance violation as a maternal privilege. But the data had left them entirely bankrupt of options. Their defense attorney quietly closed his leather portfolio, looked directly at Gary, and delivered a cold dose of reality. He bluntly advised his client to accept my terms immediately, warning that fighting this would cause the bank to call their entire commercial loan due and seize their remaining assets before the week was over. The corporate partition took exactly 4 months to clear. It was not a cinematic victory of total destruction. It was a cold, precise split designed according to standard commercial law. Under the court-supervised independent partition, I cleanly carved out my proprietary cold storage leaseholds, the primary long-haul trailer assets, and 60% of our highest volume commercial supplier lines into an autonomous logistics firm under my absolute ownership. Gary, Teresa, and Brandon were legally separated from my infrastructure, left to operate their downsized dry freight division under strict, independent quarterly audit oversight from their institutional lenders. The sudden reduction in available capital forced them into a permanent lifestyle downsize, requiring the sale of their high overhead personal properties just to satisfy the outstanding structural debt lines. Haley's lifestyle brand lost its unearned corporate subsidy overnight, reducing her digital footprint to a quiet, unverified footnote within the regional agricultural market. Only much later did the true cost of their calculation become fully visible. My stepmother, Teresa, didn't speak to me for nearly 2 months following the final execution of the partition, eventually sending one long, rambling digital message regarding family loyalty that conspicuously omitted any mention of the airport terminal gate. I deleted the thread without responding. My father issued a brief, incomplete apology through our retained attorneys, the dry, hollow sound of an aging patriarch, realizing too late that structural utility and familial attachment are entirely different metrics. 6 months after the legal split, I stood on the newly expanded concrete distribution deck of my independent logistical hub in North Chicago. The morning air was sharp and clean, carrying the deep, rhythmic roar of my transport fleet, accelerating out onto the open interstate highway under my own sovereign parameters. I had built a meaningful, highly profitable organization entirely on my own operational merit, surrounded by a professional network that valued my structural architecture rather than my compliance. True peace is never found in burning down the structure that historic family entitlement built to keep you small. It is found in having the cold, analytical clarity to step out of the engine room, claim the ground beneath your own feet, and simply let the natural consequences of their own actions catch up to them. They spent my entire adult life assuming my silence was a sign of weakness. But as the final manifest cleared my monitor, I realized that my total absence was the loudest thing they had ever been forced to hear. Has your family or workplace ever taken your hard work for granted only to panic the second you stop doing everything for them? Tell me your story in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe for more.